The memoir. We've got 4 memoirists with us today to talk about the art of the memoir. Leading the discussion as moderator is Cherie Newman, producer of The Right Question, a weekly radio program on Montana and Yellowstone Public Radio about writing and publishing, and I believe it's on Thursday nights at 7 o'clock here in
7:30.
on KUFM, and I'm not sure what time it's on Yellowstone, but
6:30.
6:30, okay. And Cherie also writes for regional publications. She writes for Montana Magazine and for High Country News. And without further ado, I introduce Cherie Newman.
Welcome, everyone. I want to introduce our real writers here. We have Rana Reiko Rizzuto. And her book is Hiroshima in the Morning, or do you say Hiroshima?
It's kind of completely flat, so you just run it all together without an accent. Sorry. It's Hiroshima.
Okay.
Yes.
And Ruth McLaughlin, and her book is Bound Like Grass. And Buzzy Jackson, Shaking the Family Tree, and Laura Munson, who wrote This Is Not the Story You Think It Is, and A Season of Unlikely Happiness. No, An Unlikely Season of Happiness.
Season of Unlikely Happiness.
Oh, okay. And all of you have written other things. Laura's a novelist, and you've also written novels. And Ruth,
Short stories.
Short stories. And Buzzy, you wrote a book previous to this that was about women who were in the blues, singing the blues.
That's right.
In the music market.
Yeah.
So I really want to start the discussion with why suddenly you're writing memoir. I know, Laura, you have a long string of novels, and memoir, this is your first nonfiction piece, and it's your only published piece. So tell us how you got started with your memoir.
Well, actually, do you know the writer Terry Tempest Williams?
Mm-hmm.
So I had the pleasure of meeting her about 10 years ago, and it's a long story, and I don't want to occupy too much time, but she ended up giving me some advice because I was wondering why my novels weren't getting published. And she said, take a year off, stop writing novels, and write your story. And never think about it getting published. Just write your story. So I actually have written another memoir called Break Me in Montana. I don't think it'll ever be published, but it's a collection of essays about kind of city girl turns country girl. And that experience really healed my writing. And so I passed that on to you. It was a writing assignment she gave me for a year of my life. And then afterwards I went back to writing novels. So I had my memoir voice already and had been writing personal essays so that when I needed to be the main character in a book, I was well poised to do so.
Buzzy, how about you?
Well, I had written, as you said, a nonfiction book before, but that was actually based on it really was my dissertation for a PhD in history that I did. And then writing this, I actually came to this book, which is, a lot of this is really about genealogy, and being a historian was how I got interested in genealogy. Because I had some students when I was teaching at Berkeley who were really amazing researchers, and they were genealogists on the side, and that was how they had developed such great research skills. So that got me interested. As I started thinking about writing a book about this world of genealogy, I also wanted to look into my own family history, and so the book is kind of a combination of those things. It's partly sort of a journalistic exploration of this world of genealogy-obsessed people, and it's also about my own family. So for me, I think it was almost a sort of accidental memoir in a sense, because I didn't really set out to write the story of my family, but I did end up writing a lot about them. So it was a little bit of a roundabout way.
And was it triggered by your son's birth?
Yeah, of course. No, that was definitely part of it. I mean, it's, when I got pregnant for the first time, I I went to the doctor, had the usual conversation that women have with their doctors, which is being handed about 3 pages of family medical history forms to fill out. And I realized I just could not fill those papers out at all. And I didn't really know just the basic information about how my grandparents had died, what, causes of death, these things. And so that definitely did spur it as well, this sort of interest and sort of shock really on my part, because as a historian, I'm supposed to know something about history, but it turned out I actually only knew about other people's history. So that got me more interested, definitely.
And Ruth, you were writing short stories and going through lots of experiences with your family, but what made you want to switch over to writing about your own family?
Well, I'd say like with Buzzy, in a way it was accidental. I had my real writing, what I called my real writing, which was short stories, and then when my family sort of fell apart in northeastern Montana in 1995, my mother got very ill, and while she was ill, my father, who was sort of emotionally distant from my brother and me, became even more distant, and we lost our land. So for a year, I just thought, I can't handle this. I quit writing what I thought was my real writing, and I said, I'm just going to write this turmoil out as it happens. It's going to be just personal, just a diary. So for a year, I wrote and wrote all the anger and the frustration of seeing our family disappear there from northeastern Montana. And when I got done, I thought, I know this is just junk, it's just terrible stuff, but I gave it to a friend of mine who'd been telling me all along, you ought to write a book. And he said, there's your book. So I had the 50 pages. It was just a matter of adding to that. So it was an accident, really. I think I thought of writing before, but I didn't want to vacate my cherished position as dutiful, perfect daughter and really challenge some of the things about my past. So kind of fell into it.
And Rana, do you prefer to be called Rana or
Either.
Reiko? Your book also ended up to be, maybe I'm reading into this, but maybe a bit of a personal catharsis as well. You went over to Japan with the intention of writing a novel. You were doing research for a novel, and you ended up writing a memoir instead. Tell us how that happened.
Yeah, I went to Japan to interview the survivors of the first atomic bomb in Hiroshima, and I was living there trying to tease out their stories for about 3 months. And since I was looking for material for a novel, I was looking for little tiny stories, and I was getting a very prepared narrative. And then basically it was a personal transformation, but it was kind of a global transformation too, because after I was there for 3 months, September 11th happened. And so my life changed, my stories changed, and their stories changed as well. And they were able to access memories that they hadn't accessed for more than 50 years, and emotions and feelings. And I guess I was then getting really the texture of what is the daily life of war that I really had wanted for the novel, and I did end up writing the novel, which is, this one came first. But I had such a life-changing experience, and the world changed, and their stories changed, and their experience changed, and I felt like I needed to really sit down and capture that.
How does being a character in your own book, how can you see the book and have any perspective on it? Do you have to end up going through a long editing process? Does somebody have to help you shape that, or does it just come out? And I'd like to start with you, Buzzy, because you actually you went on some major travels to get information for your book, including a cruise.
Yes,
a genealogy
purely
cruise.
For research purposes. Caribbean genealogy cruise. My husband and my young son were not able to come on, sadly. I had to go by myself. Yeah, I mean, being, I think for me, part of it, there's a question of being the character in your own book. And then also for me, the previous book that I had written was about women blues singers, most of whom were dead, not all of them, but a lot of them were dead. So it's easier to write about dead people because you don't have to worry what they're going to think about what you wrote. And then in this book, I was writing not only about myself, but about my own family, and then about all these people I was interviewing as well, who were very much alive. And that was, it was definitely a big balancing act. I mean, I think for me, writing about myself was not as much of a challenge as much as writing about people, especially people in my own family or people who had been very helpful to me in the writing, in the research of the book, because I felt like I was so grateful to them for helping me. And yet I couldn't just portray every single person I had met as the most wonderful person with not a single interesting quirk, and especially when I went down to the South and I visited some relatives of ours who I had never met, and it was immediately clear that our politics completely clashed and a lot clashed, but at the same time they were really wonderful people and I was staying in their house. So the idea that I was going to go get all of this great information about our family, eat their food, be driven around by them, and then go home and write this book about them was kind of galling on some level to me. But so that was one of the hardest parts of the book to write. But I actually feel like it worked out pretty okay. I just got a phone call from one of them just the other day from Mississippi, and they seem to be okay with that part of the book where I discuss our vast chasm of differences, because I tried to point out that I had certain prejudices about them, and they had prejudices about me, and that it was like these two sort of bubbles of prejudice colliding in their parlor, and yet we all really wanted to like each other too, and we were related to each other, so that helps. So I think the fact that we're still speaking is a good sign, put it that way. And I'm still speaking to everyone who is in this book, so that I am proud of that, I have to say. But maybe it makes me a more cowardly memoirist, writer. That's possible. You probably have to be willing to make a few more enemies to really, to write the tell-all kind of thing. But I didn't really find any big scandals either, so that was lucky for me.
Laura, I know that your memoir had to be a little more challenging to be a character in your book, especially because your husband was a character in your book and you were writing a book about problems in your marriage. How did you handle that on a day-to-day basis?
My in-laws were at my very first reading as a surprise. I think that if you write with compassion, you can write about anything. And I have found this to be the case. And if you write responsibly, that's also true. My author statement is that I write to provide relief for myself and other people. And so I needed this book on my bedside table during this time in my life, which was, for those of you who don't know, I went through a marital crisis and I wrote my way through it. And it felt important to me to be the main character because the readers needed to know, I thought, that this person really existed in order to go on that empathic journey. And so I made rules with myself at the beginning that I wouldn't expose anybody outside of what felt appropriate to the story. And I also wasn't writing an expose. It really is not the story you think it is. It's really not about my husband at all. It's about me and my journey. And I think for people who are writing memoir, it's important to really focus on your journey, at least for me, in this piece. That made it easier for me. And one of the first questions everybody asks during question and answer periods after I do readings is, what does your husband think about this book? You asked me that when I did the right question. That was the first question. And the answer is, he's proud of it. So, on one hand, he's a hero in the book in many ways. But I think that for him to have that reaction speaks to what happens when you do write with compassion and you are responsible for how you depict other people. Two very important components of writing memoir.
Ruth, I'm curious about whether people in your family knew that you were writing about them while you were doing the book.
Well, I come from a culture where you never say what's on your mind, and if somebody accidentally says something personal and heartfelt, you do them the favor by ignoring it. So I've got I talked with my brother for years about his stories and his experiences, and I never owned up to writing a book. I'd say, you know what I was always curious about, or I was thinking about, and he would tell me, and he wouldn't ask. So there was a lot of unspoken stuff. I was sort of disappointed when I wrote because I wanted to be a big hero in the book. I mean, gosh, I suffered. I mean, and I wanted that to be that kind of book, but I found out how mean I am because I would come to a point in a chapter and I'd suddenly realize, wait a minute, I contributed to my sister's bullying. I did this, I did that. So that was kind of tough to not be a hero, but it was a wonderful experience to be faced with some things I think I'd been in denial with for many years.
And Rana, you also put very personal things in your book. You know, without revealing too much, you did present the problems in your marriage and some personal problems. And how did you resolve that when you sat down to write? How did you decide how much information to put out there?
It's a hard one. I mean, I guess that in a way I started from a different place. I intended it to be more about other people, because I was having, my life transformed, but everybody else's life was transforming too. And so I came to it thinking, okay, well, there's what happened, and then there's why is it important enough to write about? And for me, the question of why is it important enough to write about was this question that I had about our stories and how we tell ourselves our stories and we explain ourselves to ourselves. And when the survivors' narratives changed, that was very clear to me. And then I sat back and looked at myself and said, okay, so how are your stories changing? And my ideas of motherhood were changing. My ideas of what I wanted in my life, what my storybook, teenage marriage was. And I realized that was the framework for these other people's stories. And then I think, what Laura said about if it's important to you, you have to write about it. And as long as you write about it with compassion, as long as you put yourself on the page, you are as fallible as everybody else. And that's the part that you have to tell. When I talk to people about my work, and they tell me that they cried when they read this or that or the other thing, that really means so much to me because I do write from the heart. I don't, there is some work in my head, but I need to sort of put out there exactly what happened to me, and that's what resonates with them. And as long as I'm doing that for myself, the story, everybody else's stories sort of fall into that context.
I want to also ask you about when you were over in Japan and 9/11 happened. You were interviewing survivors of the first atomic blast, and they're just horrific stories that you were uncovering. But you were having trouble getting them to tell their stories to you before 9/11 happened. So tell us about the change that came about after the terrorist attacks on New York in relation to the survivors of the atomic bombing.
Well, I think the atomic bombing. Maybe many people in the audience know a lot about it, but there was a blackout, a news blackout right afterwards. They confiscated the pictures, they confiscated the videos, they kicked out all the reporters. So it felt like a lot of people didn't really know about it, and when you hear about it, it is so horrifying. It's like the kind of nightmare that you would never. You could never conceive of until it actually happens. And so when you have that experience as a person, you need to find a way to heal. And the way that we heal is that we create this narrative. And it's like, my mother died, but she sacrificed so that we would have world peace, so we would understand what the bomb does to people. I lost my entire family, I lost my entire community, but we did this for a reason, and I can go out and speak, and I can be the voice for peace. And so the narrative that I was getting was really the healing narrative that was about how we sacrifice for peace. And of course, after September 11th, there was no peace. And so people's safety was so shaken that everything that they had believed about themselves had been destroyed. And then all of these emotions bubbled up, and they didn't know what to do with them at all. And so then they started calling me, actually, to ask me to come and talk to them so they could get them out, and that they could remember not just that day and the terrible things that happened, and how their sister died, but also how she lived, what she was like, and so it was really very different impulses for healing, two entirely different ways to heal.
You were having trouble getting interviews before 9/11, and people were calling you afterward.
Yeah.
Laura, how did your interactions with your family change once you started writing? What new awarenesses did you have of yourself, and what new awarenesses came through in your family during the process?
Well, my family of origin, so my parents and sisters, siblings, and I wasn't, I was very careful with everybody in my life, and I made serious rules about how much I was going to expose my children. I have a son who's 10 and a daughter who's 14. So when I was writing the book, I didn't actually ever think it was going to get published, but because I'm a writer and I've been working for so many years writing so many books, I still always view everything that I'm writing as something that might get published. But there was a chapter that I took out after I got a publishing deal, because I really had to have that talk with myself. People are going to read this, and how is that? If I'm being responsible, and if it actually hurts somebody, then that is not being responsible. So, and I think anybody who's writing a memoir has to deal with at least a little of this. In terms of my immediate family, my husband and my children, I never would have sent this book out to my agent without my husband reading it first. And I don't think every memoirist has that rule, but that was one of mine. And, he didn't feel like he was vilified in the book. He felt like a sympathetic character. And I hear from people all the time saying, thank you to your husband for being willing to be in this book, because this book is about empowerment ultimately, but it definitely depicts a person going through a crisis. And I think that there's a lot of people, I know that there's a lot of people in our world who are going through similar crisis because of job loss. But one thing, memoir is very hot right now because of it. People need permission to be vulnerable and share. And so, my kids, they haven't read it. It's not age appropriate. I overheard my 14-year-old daughter saying to her friends, ugh, it's about marriage. But it's really not about marriage. Do I want to be the main character in a book anytime soon? I don't know about that. I told my husband, please, no sequel to this book. No sequel. But I do think there's a time and a place for memoir, and I think it's a great genre to be writing right now in this world. I hope that answers the question.
Buzzy, when you set off on this adventure to find your relatives, I'm sure you didn't really know what to expect, but I'm curious about what happened when you found these people. You talked a little bit about, well, they're different from you, but how did that open up family for you?
Well, it's interesting because most of the book is focused on my dad's side of the family, the Jacksons. The original title for the book was The Jackson 5000, and the idea was that because Jackson is the 20th most popular surname in the country, so there's literally millions of Jacksons out there, but it was very unclear which ones we were actually related to. But I did also look into my mom's side of the family as well, and I sort of one story comes to mind when we ask that question, because I think, with genealogy, people who do genealogy will tell you that the first thing that you should do if you're looking for information about your family is go talk to your oldest relatives. For obvious reasons, they have the oldest memories and that kind of thing. And I think I had a very sort of self-important idea that my oldest relatives would just be so thrilled that I was coming to talk to them about their memories, and how wonderful, the grandchild is coming. And I went to go see one of my oldest relatives, my great aunt Selma, who's on my mom's side, and she had come over from Russia around 1914, and she was Jewish, and she had, lived through the pogroms in Russia and these kind of crazy things. And so I thought, oh, this is great. We're going to go see Aunt Selma in Detroit, and we went. And we got there. I flew there from Colorado. My mom came from California. And we showed up, and she said, well, it's so nice that you came, but I actually have a hair appointment today. So, she's 97, and she was in really great health, and she's just very, she had her own life to live. And I did manage to convince her to reschedule the hair appointment. But it happened, many times where I would go to talk to a relative and assuming they would just welcome me with open arms. And in fact, they're all friendly, but they don't, Selma did not necessarily want to spend the whole day talking about the boat trip over from Russia, like she's like, to her, it's like blah, blah, blah. Meanwhile, I'm like, what was the name of this ship? And, it's, and it happens a lot. They don't necessarily, folks, of course, don't necessarily want to talk about the thing that you want to talk about. And so it definitely did open up relationships. I just met people I hadn't even met before that I didn't know I was related to. But at the same time, it was not quite the, watershed of like, we're all just one big happy family now, because that was sort of part of the reason for writing the book, is that my family on both sides, they're all friendly and everything, but they're not, like, no one in my family has family reunions or anything like that. And after the publication of this book, we still don't have family reunions. So, I don't think it's my fault. I've done my part, damn it. But it's like I learned more about my family, but I don't think it changed anyone in my family by me asking them about it, if you know what I mean.
No kumbaya.
No kumbaya moment, no.
Ruth, did your relationship with your brother change? Has he read the book, and did it change? I know your parents are gone.
Yeah, that was my real worry, since my brother is the only person left in my birth family, and I'd kind of sneaked all these stories out of him. It was really just, a couple of years before it got published, well, just a couple of years ago when I was just revising, it was basically done, that I admitted that I'd written a book, but I think he kind of knew all along. I was really worried. I did decide to leave one or two stories about him out. I decided, you know what, he's just going to have to be embarrassed. That's going to happen. He's going to be embarrassed, but he didn't buy into this to be humiliated. So there are some stories that I think he would find humiliating. And I thought to myself, they don't really add to the book. They're not necessary to the book. So I left those stories out. And I think the wonderful thing that's happened to him is that a guy in Culbertson, who was his high school classmate, in fact, the only person in his high school class who has stayed in Culbertson, my brother told him about the book. He read the book. He bought 6 copies and is mailing them all over the country. And he wrote my brother the nicest email that I think makes my brother seem validated. He said, I didn't know how tough you had it. He said, you are a self-made man. I admire you. So it's been a wonderful experience, I think, for my brother. He's proud of me, and he feels validated in some way.
Well, we've talked a bit about the ethics of deciding what to put in a book or not put in a book, but there's also the time when, Rana, I think I noticed this most in your book, when you have to not name someone, and yet it's important that they be in the book. So maybe you could share with us a little bit about how you created a composite character. I'm not remembering her name right now.
Ani. Yeah, that was actually just, it wasn't so much about trauma or traumatizing someone. It was just about logistics. When I went to Japan, I lived there for 6 months, and I became very friendly with 2 groups of peace activists, and there were lots and lots of translators, and I must have had like 15 friends who would go out and translate for me. And The first time I put together this book, I took all of the notes that I had been making about my fascinating life in Japan, which was deadly boring for everybody else. And one of the reasons that it was boring was it was almost incomprehensible because there were 6 Keikos and 4 Marikos and all of these people, and nobody could keep track of anybody. And it was real in that they were all there, and that's the person who did this interview. And it was kind of exhausting and nonsensical for anybody who tried to read it. So I decided to take the main things that happened with some very important people, and I think I took about 9 of them, and I turned them into one character, who is Ami. And everything that happened with Ami happened with wonderful and dear friends of mine. And she's the translator who goes through and not only helps me in key places, but delivers some very important messages. But it worked that way, and I admit it in the back. And otherwise, it wouldn't. I don't think that with the strangeness of the names and the repetition of the names, I think people could have understood what the experience was like. So in a way, even though I doctored the person, I think the experience of my time with these people and my friendship with these people is actually real and more real than it would have been if I hadn't done it.
I'm trying to imagine the book with Keiko 1, Keiko 2. And I did have a friend once who kept having a series of men friends whose names were Michael. And so we started naming them Michael 1 and Michael 2 and Michael 3. Laura, were there any places in your book, yours was in real time, but were there any places where you kind of disguised somebody?
Because I wanted to keep this about my journey, I actually wrote about non-existent people. Like the reader is a character in my book, and also the destructive thoughts that we all have in our heads. I was trying to become keenly aware of those destructive thoughts, so I had to name her. So I call her my evil twin sister, Sheila, and I don't know where I came up with that name. So with apologies, it's like number 5 in Australia right now, so I keep waiting to get an angry Sheila letter. But and then I also wrote a lot about my father who had died, and there are plenty of non-living people in this book, and that was kind of my way around that. And there are people who don't appear in it at all, and people who know my family wonder why that is, but that was because I was protecting a couple contentious relationships in my life, and it didn't feel applicable to this book. So that evil twin sister Sheila and the reader and my dead people. Chickened out a little bit, in other words.
Buzzy, I know there must have been people you left out, but did you make a composite of anybody?
I did not make a composite of anybody. I did ask all of my relatives who I interviewed if they actually wanted me to use their real names. And partly it's because in genealogy, the sort of standard convention is that, you have family trees, and then when you get up to people who are living, you don't necessarily, like this is for people who put family trees on the internet and stuff, you don't necessarily put all the details or even the full names of people who are still alive on the internet just to protect their privacy. And so with that in mind, I asked my family members if they actually wanted me to reveal, the year they were born, their real name, who they married, stuff like that. And actually everybody was really open to me using their names, except for my cousin Mooner, who's in the book. And you can tell by Buzzy and Mooner that we are a family of nicknamer people. And I also have a cousin, Flipper. She's not in the book. But so Mooner, that's her real nickname. She didn't actually want me to use her real name in the book, and which was fine. And frankly, I was shocked that everyone else was okay with it. Just because I think, I don't know, just on a privacy level, I was surprised people were okay with it. So far, it's been fine. I had one relative, a cousin, who I had planned on visiting in the South. She was another Southern cousin I had never met. And right around the time Obama got elected, we started having these weird emails where she would say things like, I'm not sure y'all are ready to meet your Southern cousins, and I think, I am not sure either. So I had this plan to go meet her in Atlanta, and I was getting so anxious about it, and these weird passive-aggressive emails kept coming. Finally, I just said, "No, I'm not going to go meet her. Like, I'm just not. Why am I doing this?" She didn't actually have a lot of genealogical information, and I couldn't really see myself writing about it if it was really a terrible thing. So I just emailed her and told her I, in fact, was not ready to meet all my Southern cousins, and just still haven't met her. So there you go. We're Facebook friends, though. You know. Oh, yeah, we're very close.
How about you, Ruth?
Well, I didn't do any composites. I did try to disguise some people by changing their names. I thought they would mind. I heard from some of those people, and they certainly identified themselves in the book. But I think the most wonderful surprise I've had in the book, I was really worried about some of my parents' neighbors and just people who might sort of know our family, or even people who wouldn't know me, who would look at some of the things I said in this book or some of the things I owned up to doing. And like when I would open my email and there would be an email this long, I would just cringe and think, oh no, what are they going to say? But I forgot the wonderful magic of writing, which is that people read this book, and then what they said to me is, this really stirred up something in me. And then they would tell me their story. Or they would call me on the phone, and 2 hours later, I would have their story. And it's wonderful. Like somebody, I didn't realize how many people still, my age, still harbored hurt from relationships with parents. As somebody said to me, I have to figure out now, how'd she say that in an email? She said, maybe there's a bunch of us out there for whom don't play on the railroad tracks had to mean I love you. So it's really been kind of wonderful that I feel like it's related to people.
Was there, Ruth, was there any point, go ahead and drink water.
Okay.
It's exhausting work up here. Was there any point at which you were, say, halfway or three-quarters of the way through the book where you felt like, I just can't continue this?
Yeah, there really were. And I would make deals with myself. When I get to some part of a chapter that would just make me feel really uncomfortable, I would say, okay, this is going to be the chapter. You need to finish writing it because it'll be a good writing experience. But if you don't like it at the end, this will be the chapter just for you. You don't have to put this one out there. So that was how I got myself to keep writing. And then, once I'd worked on something and gone over and over and over, I just felt kind of numb to it. But I didn't write this in order because I was so puzzled about how to write a book and intimidated by it. After I had that big chunk of 50 pages, that's 2/3 of the way through the book. Then I went back and I just told stories and had a bunch of stories. And then I had a wonderful editor at the University of Oklahoma Press who made me rewrite it 4 times and figure out a way to tie it together and use my head and think about how is it that Eastern Montana and that kind of isolation and that poor economy over there, how would that have influenced some of the difficulties in your family? So I think there's Eastern Montana as a character, my parents and my grandparents. So I had a lot of editing help that really helped me.
How about you, Rana? Did you at any point just say, I'm not doing this?
I didn't say I'm not doing this, but I did do it and then throw it in a drawer for 2 years and then do it again and take it out. And one of the things that was an issue sort of in the middle of the book, in the writing of the book, was that my mother, who is now in late stage Alzheimer's, was still at a point where my father didn't want us to talk about it. And so he had this idea that if he just told people, oh, well, everybody loses their memory, and she remembers more than I do, and then he just hid in the house, that nobody would know, and that then if nobody said anything to her, she wouldn't become depressed and die. And so faster. And so therefore, if I said anything, then I was going to kill my mother faster than she would otherwise be declining. And so at one point, I wrote this whole narrative because I realized that she had to be in the book. I wrote a fictional mother who dies from cancer. And so it was a hybrid book. And that was really cathartic for me because I could really go to the places that I needed to go to. And then that didn't work because the publishers and the booksellers really don't like that. They're like, where do we put this thing? Well, we can't put it anywhere, so you can't publish it. And so then I finally had to face that and go back and say, okay, this has to just be real. And so that was sort of my moment of, okay, face this. And the interesting thing was that when I went back and turned the fictional mother into a non-fictional mother, 80% of what I had written was exactly what ended up being real. It was like, oh, I don't have to change this. Wow, I don't have to change that either. I just have to like change these 3 words or this sentence. I had linked so much of this fictional woman's like cancer to their cancer, and then when I changed it to memory, it was like, whoa, it had been there all along because the whole book is about memory, and it was waiting for me to get up that courage to say, okay, here it is.
That's fascinating. I want to come back to that fiction and nonfiction in a minute. But Laura, as you were writing in real time, did you just at some point say, this is too hard emotionally to sustain? Because you were writing day after day as everything was happening.
Well, writing is my practice. That's what I do. And it's sometimes my prayer. It's sometimes my meditation. And it's, sometimes my way to life. And so writing this book was a lifeline for me. But having written mostly novels, I would say that memoir is still a craft. It's still architectural. You're still out on scaffoldings building this thing. And so it wasn't just, Dear Diary explosion on the page. I had a journal for that, and my horse hurt a lot that summer. And I had a good therapist during this time too, and a couple choice friends. But really, it is a craft. And I think a lot of people don't know that. Because especially like for me, I'm writing to the reader, and so it comes across like I've heard from a lot of people who say, I feel like I'm hanging out with my best friend drinking tea or having a glass of wine. And I love hearing that. But it's still, I think it was Oscar Wilde who said that easy reading is damn hard writing. And I think memoir should be easy to read, but remember, there's always somebody, the marionetteur or whatever, is still crafting it.
Somebody living the story.
Yeah.
Did you ever have any feedback from an editor that you didn't want to follow?
I worked with Amy Einhorn, who has her own imprint at Putnam, and she's the editor of The Help, which is doing really well. It's a novel. And she is that kind of intuitive editor that every writer dreams of. And she actually, this is good for everybody to know, I think. Never once did anybody ask me to sensationalize this story or sell out. In fact, I was asked to go on Oprah, and the publishers said no because it was the wrong context. They wanted me to go on a panel of people who stayed together with their spouses no matter what. That's not what my book is about at all.
The producers of Oprah wanted you to be on that panel.
Yeah,
you're saying.
and I thought, oh no, Putnam's going to make me go. And they said, we just don't think it's the right context. It's really not the spirit of your book. So that's good news that the publishing world has integrity like that. The end.
That is good to know.
Yeah, it is good to know. But I should say, so all that said, Amy Einhorn actually said to me, do you really want that one chapter in there? And I thought, no, I don't really want that chapter in there. Thank you. I was just mad at a family member that had nothing to do with that time in my life. And, so that'll go in a novel somewhere.
Buzzy, what kind of a relationship did you have with your editor?
Great. I mean, first of all, it was great. Her name's Michelle Howery at Touchstone, which is an imprint of Simon & Schuster. And I thought she was great, but I have to say, I worked in the publishing industry for a couple years in the 90s for a literary agency, and I definitely had the experience there of realizing how much editing happens before it's even submitted to a publisher. And so I'm not sure if it was just because of that experience or because of just how I am myself, but I really the stuff that I submitted to my editor was, in my mind, like very polished. You know, I didn't really look to her to edit very much. And she hardly, I mean, she read everything and she made comments, but there was not a lot of close editing, except one chapter I sent her. She sent it back, and I thought, oh, this is weird. She didn't send me the whole chapter back. And I emailed her, and she goes, oh, no, I just cut half of it. And I said, okay. Yeah, sure, no problem. But, you know, she's actually right. You know, that's fine. She was right and about that. It just had gone on too long. You know, the cruise, there's a lot of drinking involved. And so it was actually part of the cruise chapter. But so it wasn't that, I don't know if I should say it wasn't that closely edited, or, you know, it was just perfect when I sent it to her. It's really hard to say. I'm just kidding.
Let's vote for door number 2.
Yeah, why not? No, but I will say that I don't really, like, I guess my preference is to have somebody who, it gives me a lot of freedom, put it that way. And it worked out really well, I think.
And what kind of suggestions did you get from your editor, Ruth?
Well, the first thing he said was, just because you put all these chapters in a box and mail them all together in a box doesn't mean it's a book. And, you know, he said, you just got to find a theme here. He was wonderful, and it just probably is a testimony to how lame it really was when I sent it to him, because everything that he said, I thought, oh, yes, it was like a light went on in my head. So the first thing he said was just to try to, I think it was a little overwrought when I first wrote it, and he said, maybe you could have a little more sympathy for some of the characters. So I had to go back and be a little more fair. That's the first thing. And then the other thing is, he said, you know, you've got to do some background and some explanation. You know, why would your parents, your grandparents, your brother and your sister, why would they be impotent in the face of some of these things? What was it about the area you grew up in and that sort of thing? So I went through and did all that. And then next time he said, throw away 50 pages. I tried to write a couple of chapters totally on my homesteading grandparents and their point of view. And he said, you know, you just aren't close enough. Throw it all away. And as you go through the book, take things from that chapter that will help explain something. That's an incident that's happening, or explain maybe your parents or your brothers and sisters' attitude. And that worked really well. So it was a matter of making me think more, really. He just made me think more, and I just thought it worked out really well. I never felt like, what is he talking about? It was always like a light bulb would go on in my head, because I wasn't really happy with it when I sent it away. So I was really happy with my editor.
What was your experience, Rona?
I think I did everything that people are talking about before it actually ended up in the editor's hands. And I guess I was listening to you and I was thinking, yes, I went through that, and I would love it if my students at Goddard heard you say that, because they never believe me when I say that this is what's going to happen. Like, first you put it in the box, then you figure out, like, what is the central question, and then you have empathy, and everything that you went through, I think that we all go through in different stages. But for me, I always wished that I was edited. And my first novel, I went to Terry Carton at HarperCollins, and she had a reputation for being the world's most amazing editor, and she changed a word. And then this one, you know, I had it out, and it actually got rejected a lot, because it's fragmented, it's a collage, it's a poem, it's all sorts of things that mainstream editors don't want. And so it took about 2 years to find a home, and then I found Amy Scholder, who's the editorial director at the Feminist Press, and she was with City Lights. She's with 7 Stories. She's kind of got an amazing track record, and she had edited several of my friends at different publishing houses, and they were like, she's fabulous, she's amazing, she's a great editor, she's going to take the book, she's going to make it perfect. And when I met her and she said she wanted it, I said, so what should we do? And she said, well, we'll just publish it. And I said, well, but what do I need to do? What do I need to change? Nothing. She didn't change a word. And so I've always, like, wished that I had somebody to chew it over with, and I've wished that I was like a playwright so that I could, put my characters on the stage and people could give me input. But I think actually it's just that I'm a really slow writer. This one took 7 years to actually hand to Amy, and Why She Left Us took 5. So I think I got to do that whole process in my own kind of lonely way before I found the editors.
So you were self-editing as you went along. How are we doing on time? Anybody know?
That's it.
3 minutes. Oh.
You must be in radio.
Okay, 5 minutes. Questions?
Well, I'm just wondering, sort of line of what you're talking about, what was your past publication? And you were all writers before, so maybe you already had an agent as a publisher, but further was difficult or rejections and just interested in that.
Well, I actually sent this to my agent, and she said, I'm not sending your work out anymore because the 2 novels that I've shopped around have gone almost all the way, and then at the very last minute, they can't convince everybody that it's worth taking a risk on an unknown author. This is my first published book. So what you hear a lot as a writer is you need a platform, and it's the bane of every writer's existence. How are you supposed to get a platform, And she said, why don't you get something published in the New York Times? And I said, oh, okay, I'll do that after I pick up the kids and go grocery shopping. And but in fact, that's what it required for me to get a book published. So that's not the greatest news in the world, but what? I wrote the short version of this, and I submitted it to the Modern Love column, which is in the Sunday Style section, and a lot of people read that essay. The next morning, the responses to it crashed the website, and the next morning, I'm standing there making eggs, and the phone rings, and my husband says, Good Morning America's on the phone? And so if you can find a platform, the Modern Love column is a really good place to start.
Yeah, well, I think that, I do think that, as Laura sort of mentioned, she had written several novels and it had not been able to get published. I've written a novel that has not been able to get published. It's certainly much easier to get published in nonfiction than in fiction, just in general. And that's pretty obvious if you just look at the New York Times book section and see how much space they devote to nonfiction versus fiction. And then poetry. It's still not like so easy to get a nonfiction book published, but it is much easier than publishing a novel. And I went the route, I already had an agent, and as I mentioned, I had worked in publishing, so I kind of knew some people in that world from that experience. But I pitched the idea to my agent, and he liked it, and I wrote a book proposal, and they really liked that. And then the editor said, what she ended up saying was, well, I keep files on my desk of ideas that I'm interested in. And she mostly does nonfiction. And she said, and I've had this genealogy file on my desk for like 3 years, and I just thought this was a great genealogy proposal. I just thought, phew, But I think that's what a lot of editors do. They have their little things that they're interested in, and then they just wait for the right proposal to come in. I do think it's important, having been on the side of the on the business side of it, I do think it's really important to remember that publishers, even in today's world of publishing, they need content. Like, they need people to be submitting material to them, whether it's fiction or nonfiction. And I just say that to encourage everyone and myself, because it's really, there's nothing for them to do unless writers send them material. That's really it. There's only so many reality TV stars out there whose books they can publish. So on that level, I would say you should all of us should be encouraged by that, because we're the ones who can produce the books, really. So that would be my
I'll
my two
just
cents.
add that if you think you have a good idea, be persistent. Don't take it personally if somebody doesn't respond to you, or if you get a bad response. Just go, don't have time for you, and move on.
Yeah, totally.
Ruth, what was your experience?
Well, I'd had a little trouble getting published, and I think half the reason was the book was a mess, and the other half was that at least a couple of the publishers of typically Western literature said, well, this isn't what we publish, because there are horses in the book, but there are also tractors in the book. It's not really the Midwest, and it's not really the West. So it was, I had a little trouble, but I'm completely happy with what, where I ended up, so.
I would just say, because we were talking about already having an agent, it's really important to find the right agent if you don't have one. And, it's the way that they tell you to do it on any internet site of like, go to the library, the bookstore, pull out the books that you love that are like yours, and you know that it's going to resonate with this person, and then just be persistent, because these people work their butts off, and you need a fierce advocate. I mean, you need somebody who's going to take this book to 30 people, and she or he by now knows who those people are because they love the same thing, and they've been in the business 20 years loving the same books, and you have to find those people, and then everything will fall into place. But just sending it out to any old person you get off a list, it doesn't work, because these people really, they work really hard for their money, and you have to find that person who just loves it. They're not going to say, well, I sent it to 5 people and whatever, bring me your next project. You need to kind of fall in love, so I would say that.
Shall we continue the conversation out in the book signing area?
Okay. Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks.